for presenting.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Let me share my screen. Oh, okay. All right, so perfect. So we are going to talk to you guys today about digital consent, and oh, I pressed the wrong button. I always go through technical difficulties every time. Okay, so we're going to be talking to you guys today about digital consent and online harassment. So like was introduced, my name is Denisha. I'm with the Center for Sexual Assault Survivors in Newport News, Virginia, and I'm joined by one of our amazing volunteers, Sarah Williams, to talk to you guys today. So there's a lot of information to kind of go through here, so it might seem like we're kind of going through it a little bit fast, but of course there will be time for questions at the end, or if anything kind of comes up that you're wondering more about, you can feel free to drop that in the chat and we'll make sure to get to it. And the slides will also be available for you all to view after the presentation. So we are going to be talking to you guys today about what consent is, to gain just a greater understanding of what exactly consent is, and also what it looks like online, whether there's any differences when we are talking about consent in person versus digitally. Then we're going to switch to gears and talk a little bit about the different forms of online sexual violence and harassment and what it can actually look like when we're online. And then of course, talk about some of the ways to actually support somebody who has been a victim of sexual violence. So I always like to start with just what sexual violence is, just because I feel like that's part of the big basis for this conversation. So you can see sort of some examples of the different forms here, but sexual violence is generally defined as this all-encompassing non-legal term that is any kind of sexual activity that happens without the victim's consent or the person's consent. And we're going to talk a little bit later again about what consent is. So most of these you've probably heard of to some degree. Some of them you may not have heard of, but we're going to be looking specifically at cyber harassment and, to some degree, sexual abuse and sexual assault as well. So these are some statistics from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center around sexual violence and teenagers. This is a study of 7th to 12th grade students that found that 56% of girls have experienced any kind of sexual harassment and 40% of boys have experienced any kind of sexual harassment. So this is not something that just happens to, certain groups or certain people. It can happen to anyone. And in fact, as you can see, it is incredibly prevalent. And, it's something that happens equally in person and online. As you can see, 35% of boys and 52% of girls experience sexual harassment in person. And then 24% of boys and 36% of girls experience sexual harassment online. And so as you can see, later on, experiencing sexual harassment online is not any less valid, right? And it can still have equally devastating and traumatic impacts and effects on a person. So I also wanted to just add in some statistics around sexual violence against transgender or non-binary youth, just because it wasn't included in that previous slide. This is from another study that was done by the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. So as you can see here, again, significant rates of harassment and sexual violence, 78% for harassment, 35% for physical assault, and 12% for sexual violence. And so I also want to point out that this is based on what is actually reported. There are very high rates of people who don't report, right? Especially younger people, because they may think that they're not going to be believed. And so when you also identify with a group that historically has been marginalized and victimized and delegitimized, then you may be even less likely to speak up because of those, multiple barriers that make it harder for you to speak up, or those multiple levels of oppression. So, these statistics are, based on the fact of the numbers that are reported to us and are likely very much higher than what we see here. So I'm going to switch things over to Sarah now, who's going to talk to you guys a little bit about consent.
Okay, so our whole agenda today is talking about consent in general. And what we wanted to do is point out there are really 4 components to consent. And as you can see here, We're talking about consent that needs to be clear. It's not um, in any way obscure. It's coherent, it's understood, it's willing, and it's ongoing. So those four things need to be considered with consent. Um, when we say it's clear, one of the things I think that we tend to forget is that consent is not implied. It is not just the absence of saying no. It has to be very clearly a yes in whatever activity is being requested or entered into. Even saying I'm not sure or maybe, those are the type of things that we can't say that is clear consent. To be coherent, people that have in any way been compromised or are in a vulnerable situation, like they're asleep or under the influence of anything, they cannot consent because they are not coherent enough. They cannot make a clear yes answer to what is going on. So that is what we talk about when we're about being coherent. Someone cannot make a rational, reasonable decision because they lack that capacity, because they are not, clearly thinking. Also, it has to be willing. You can't pressure someone into giving consent. So you can't say, but if you loved me, or, you can't do that. You can't use pressure to have someone consent. It has to be completely their free will. So it's not obtained through psychological or emotional manipulation, which we've seen considerable amounts of. It cannot be because of a threat. It needs to be no kind of physical threat. It can't be because someone's in power over you. It needs to be your own willing consent, your choice. Also, in a situation, it has to be ongoing. So what happened earlier, when you consented to, one thing, doesn't necessarily mean that you are consenting later on. So that it has to be an ongoing, open conversation and understanding between the parties, that it is not just a one-time consent that gives you a free rein. So if someone consents to one sexual activity, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll consent to the next. So that's the four things that we talk about there. It needs to be clear, coherent, willing, and ongoing. And then go to the next slide. So this is kind of the difference between those, consent and coercion. We think of consent as just going along with something, but that's not so. This needs to be a definite yes, a definite, I want this to happen, I like that, or I don't like that. If they're in the opposite side, on the X side there under coercion, saying things like, or having someone say, if you really love me, or I'll make it worth your while, come on, for one reason or another, that's coercion. That's asking someone to do something that they're being pressured into. Consent is given completely voluntary, and the words and actions that go along with that need to be voluntary. If there's any sense of pressure, then it's not true consent. Next. So we have a little video for you here that is one of my favorites. It is, you may have seen it before, but it very clearly explains in a simplistic way what consent is. So we're going to play this video for you.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please. That's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
Sarah, you're muted.
We feel like that's a very clear presentation of what consent is, and that it can be presented to any group of people, any age group pretty much can understand that, which is also very beneficial. And it can be a great illustration for someone who is not maybe grasping the extent of what consent might be. And of course, what we're talking about today is how, online consent could be. So that's not a physical in-person relationship necessarily, but how is consent different when we're online versus when we're in person? It's really not. The same type of consent needs to be given. It may not be that you're physically with that person, but the parameters around those things are the same. So moving on to the next slide, we talk about digital consent. It's just like any other kind of sexual activity. If you're involved in that activity online, you still have to be comfortable, you still have to be safe, you still have to respect the person's wishes. So it never can be under pressure or coerced. Or also, if someone shares something intimate with you online, or you share something with them intimately online, you don't have the right to just share it with somebody else. So digital consent, just because they've given it to you, does not mean that you can give it to somebody else. If you have a question about that, you should definitely check with your partner or the other person about the boundaries. Is it okay? Ask permission. Again, it needs to be a clear yes. It needs to go back to those 4 things, that it is clear and concise and ongoing. Just because you consented to one thing online doesn't mean you've consented to everything. So check with the other person that's involved, and make sure that it is okay to share. And again, you shouldn't be coerced to do this online. Because as we know, once it's online, we don't know where it's going. We don't know how many people have access to it. And so therefore, what you might think as a private engagement may become public. So that's something to consider. especially with sexual interactions. You want to protect yourself. So again, digital consent is the same as in person, and we need to respect that. So then we go on to the next slide, talks about how is consent, how does it apply to non-sexual interactions? Because we're talking about sexual consent to sexual activity, but consent does expand further than that. And it goes to things like sharing a conversation that you had with somebody and then going in and sharing it with somebody else. Or a selfie that you took with your best friend, you feel is okay to share, but you might want to get their consent before posting that online. Even down to something simple as giving somebody's phone number out because you thought that it was okay. You really need consent for that. So there are multiple things that are non-sexual interactions that also need consent. So it's just something that we should consider. And that's it. Sexual violence online.
All right, so, now that we have a little bit more of an understanding around what consent is, we're going to kind of jump into a few different forms of what sexual violence can look like online. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be talking about like coercion when it comes to sexting, online harassment, revenge porn, and grooming online. But I do want to emphasize that even though we are only going to be talking about these four, this is not like all encompassing of what everybody's experience with sexual violence online, right? It's not the only way that sexual violence can happen online. It's just, for the purposes of this, these are the four that we're going to kind of hone in on for today. And I chose these four just because on the next slide, I'm going to show you guys one more video that I think touches on all four of these really well. And so I'm going to show you that video, and then we're going to kind of break down that video and then each of these subtopics for how sexual violence can happen online.
Everything seems so much more innocent in a text. Especially coming from your boyfriend. Kevin was this awesome guy I met online. He went to another school and he had a cool car. We talked all the time. He made me feel good. He was like my own private adventure. It was exciting and fun. When he started asking for revealing pictures, I guess I just thought it was normal. At first, it was embarrassing. But I was like, it's just a bikini top. And he said he really loved me. And yeah, it felt kind of good knowing somebody wanted to see me. Especially when I didn't always feel that good about myself. But it got to be so much pressure. He kept asking for more. And for me to take off my bra. It made me think about how much I really knew Kevin. We'd only actually hung out in person a few times. The last time we ended up at some guy's house party and things got really physical. I didn't say anything, but it kind of felt like that was all he wanted. A lot of his behavior was coming off so creepy. When I stopped sending them, he got pissed. I just wanted him to chill out with the requests. But he started sending, like, immature threats. Seriously? Really? So it was going downhill fast. I tried to ignore him, but he was blowing up my phone. Then the plot thickened. Jonathan?
Hey, Kim. Have you seen your picture up?
Oh my God. He posted one of my pictures. I had never felt betrayed like that before. Our private relationship, my trust, was being used against me. It was beyond over, and I let him know it.
Hello?
But Kevin still has my photos, and I can't control what he does with them. I loved how my relationship with him felt so private until it made me feel powerless. Be careful. Online relationships can be dangerous. That sense of privacy feels safe and exciting, but that privacy can also isolate you and lead to manipulation. But no matter what you've agreed to in the past, you can change your mind, and that decision should always be respected.
She's right. Actually, Kim, can I say something?
Please do.
If you're the person pressuring someone to do something they're not comfortable with, after they've said no, you're acting like a predator. Being in a relationship means respecting the other person's choices. And I can't believe I have to say this, but if you're demanding nudes, sharing them, or threatening to share them, that's disgusting, not to mention illegal. Anyone who does that loses all respect.
Thanks, Jonathan.
No problem. Sorry for interrupting.
If you find yourself in a similar situation and you're struggling with what to do, talk to someone you trust. What happened to me has been hard to move past, but talking about it has helped a lot, and hopefully it can help you too. Everything seems so much.
That's pretty much the gist of the video. But yeah, so I really like that video. I think it kind of covers, like I said, a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the next couple slides. Like you could see very clearly like that coercion, pressuring, the threats, like the blackmail, posting the pictures as well. So I think it covers kind of a lot of what we're talking about here when we're talking about digital consent and online harassment. So I'm going to go to the next slide and then pass it over to Sarah.
Okay, so coercion and sexting. We touched on coercion a little bit earlier. So sexting, as the slide says, means sending sexual photos, videos, or messages from your iPhone or from your phone or computer. Some people don't feel comfortable about that, and that's okay. There's different reasons why you might want to share that, but not everyone is comfortable with it, yet some are, but you still believe when you're sending it that it's a private message. So it's never okay to send unwanted sext or text that includes sexual images. Even to a long-term partner, it's something that is, that needs to have that consent again. So it's become very popular, of course, especially with younger people, but it's that still goes between you and the person that you're sending those messages to. If your partner is okay with it, then ask them before you send anything. So again, it comes down to that consent on both sides. And sharing something intimate with someone that wasn't meant for another person is it's a violation of trust, and it could be illegal because depending on the age and so forth. So it's not just about what you receive, but what you send, and also who you send it to and receive it from. So sharing intimate photos with someone, just be very cautious and remember that there are guidelines and always need consent.
Awesome, yeah. And then, so before I go to the next slide, I just want to kind of piggyback off of that and just, reiterate kind of what Sarah was saying, that it is never like the victim's fault or that other person's fault for trusting somebody, right? It's not their fault. Like some people might want to ask, like, oh, well, like, why did you send that? Why would you do that in the first place? Why would you trust that? But instead, we need to be asking, the perpetrator, why did you pressure someone into doing something that they weren't comfortable with? Why did you take advantage of this person's trust? Why did you do something that you knew would be harmful? And so I just think it's, especially when it comes to like sexting and coercion, it's so imperative that we kind of flip this victim blaming narrative that we have sometimes, where we're always putting that onus of like responsibility and safety on the victim, when in reality, it was that perpetrator who decided to cause harm to someone else. So I told Sarah I wouldn't go on a tangent, but I'll just leave it at that. And then hop into this second part on online harassment. So online harassment, oh, let me move these cameras out of the way, I can't see. So it is a very specific type of engagement that involves a specific intent to cause harm, and it can also be emotional harm and can create a high subjective level of distress on the part of the victim or the survivor. And I want to highlight this subjective part because we do not decide what is distressing for someone else, right? If you tell me that someone has been hurtful to you and my response is that, well, you know, it's not that big of a deal or it's just a joke, I am delegitimizing your experience, and that's not okay. If something is distressing for you, then that is valid and it should be respected. So, you know, what is okay for some people is not okay for other people. And, you know, I think that when we are online, we have a tendency to kind of dismiss this type of distress of, you know, well, it's the internet, like, what do you expect? Or you need to have thicker skin, or, you know, come on, it's just a comment, just turn off your phone, you know, all these things that are really, you know, hurtful to somebody. And it's not okay because a person has told you that this is affecting them and you are making them feel like they're the problem. When in reality, again, that responsibility is always on the person who is causing the harm. And so this type of harassment can be incredibly devastating and, you know, insidious because it can be very difficult for the victim to really ascertain or kind of figure out the true nature of the threat or of the message, especially given that, you know, online, a lot of times the messages are, you know, anonymous and, you know, it's virtual. So you don't really know what that other person might be thinking. And so with online sexual harassment, you know, it can involve, again, those unwanted comments and messages made to you of some kind of sexual nature or because of your gender. And it can come in a variety of forms, you know, those inundation of messages, extortion, comments on your appearance. You know, you saw in the video where Kevin continually kept, you know, harassing her to, you know, send those pictures and to do something that she really wasn't comfortable with. And, you know, later on was like, well, I have these pictures as like blackmail. So, you know, it's very normal for this type of abuse and for this type of harassment to cause stress and anxiety and even trauma through, you know, very extreme fear and distress, especially when, you know, so much of our lives are online, especially now. And, you know, these things can reach anybody. So it's very normal for it to cause a lot of stress and even trauma from dealing with online sexual harassment. So these are just, again, some common themes of digital abuse and online harassment. A lot of these are things that you probably heard or saw as examples in that video. So they can be done by dating partners, it can be classmates, it can be friends, it can be anonymous people, you know, it could be anybody that is doing this. So there's coercion, again, which we talked about when somebody is pressuring you or harassing you to do something that you're not comfortable with. You have that control, you're, you know, wanting to maintain that control and power over another person. You know, maybe you've heard this, we say this a lot in our trainings, but sexual violence is ultimately a crime of power and control. It is somebody who wants to exert control over another person, and it's not about sexual desire. It's about wanting that control over somebody. So there's also degradation when somebody's belittling you or devaluing you, that embarrassment and shame. So if somebody is threatening to share certain images or post information, threats and manipulation, and then as well isolation. So trying to separate someone from their support system so that they can be victimized. You heard in the video where the speaker said that, you know, their relationship felt very private, and that is a tactic that can be used to further isolate that victim or survivor. So I will pass it over to Sarah, who will talk about revenge porn.
Okay, so transitioning into revenge porn, that terminology is not always clear to some people, but basically, just as the slide shows here, it's the sharing of sexually explicit pictures, videos, or other multimedia content without others, without the subject's consent, and with the intent to embarrass or humiliate that person. So, like Denisha was just saying, sharing those things in a private setting, when in the little video, the girl thought it was all private. This takes it to the next level where someone is really trying to put them under that shame, trying to embarrass them, trying to control them or coerce them by putting those things out to other people, whether it's to their friends list, as Kevin in the video mentioned, or whether it's to the internet. We're talking about, sending out explicit pictures or videos that anyone could view. It is broken down into two subcategories: intimate image abuse, which is the most commonly used after breakup, which is what happened in the video. He's threatening, because you broke up with me, or because you won't do what I say, because you won't send me any more pictures. They're believing they're going to control the victim or punish them for leaving the relationship. So that's the intimate image abuse. And then sextortion, which really is like blackmail. It is used to threaten a victim or person into doing something that they don't want to do. And can be carried out by virtually anyone. Someone can take that same image off the internet that doesn't know you and use it against you. So it is exponential once it gets out on the internet. It's not just limited to between you and this one other person. So what we want to focus, though, is on that revenge porn is a violation of not just privacy, but your sense of dignity. You have no control over that. It's not your choice. And as we've talked about consent, those things that go between you and another person need to be with consent. So how much more so when it's put out on the internet? It needs to be with your consent. So it can strip someone of their dignity. It can make you feel like your privacy has been violated, and you never know exactly how far it's going to go. So you don't know who's going to see it, your family, your friends, your parents, you don't know. And this is a control tactic that some individuals will use that can have just ongoing effects for the victim. So back to Denisha.
And so the last thing, with these four that I want to talk about just a little bit is on grooming online. So grooming is a very methodical and intentional process of building trust and a relationship with a person. And again, this doesn't have to be a dating partner. It can be as a friend or a mentor or even like an authority or celebrity figure. And it is for the purpose of manipulating and victimizing a person. So it often can start out with very innocent conversations of getting to know someone, sharing interests, and it can seem very harmless. And, in most cases it is, but it's important to remember that intent behind it, right? So the goal is for the person to send or, post photos or engage in some kind of sexual activity or conversation or actually meeting in real life. And so this is something that can take place over one conversation or over a longer period of time. And grooming can be very difficult for the person to really understand what's happened. And that's because, again, it's about building trust with another person. So they've learned to sort of care for this person or to trust them to some degree. And so, but for the perpetrator, they're doing it for that purpose of abusing or exploiting the survivor. And that can have really, really devastating effects on a person's ability to trust. So, you could make the case in that video that we saw that Kevin could have been grooming her because it involves that isolation. You try to isolate somebody from their support system. And then, it started out very harmless, like she was saying. And then as they developed their relationship, he ended up continually asking her for those photos. So grooming, again, is a very intentional process that can seem harmless to maybe people from the outside looking in, but it's all about what that person's intent is when they are building that relationship with a person. So I am going to pass it back to Sarah, who's going to talk about a little bit about the aftermath of online sexual violence.
Okay, so after any traumatic event, there's going to be some of these types of reactions. And the main thing is to validate these for the victim or the person that's the survivor. Even though they may not have been physically assaulted, as we're talking about, in person, online, that type of violence and that sense of losing control is going to be there. So they're going to experience things like the decreased ability to concentrate. They're going to possibly have difficulty making day-to-day decisions. We see this in a lot of trauma survivors. Increased levels of anxiety, of course, that could lead into all kinds of things, because if you're been a victim online and then you have to go online for your job, or you have to go online for other non-related activities, that can cause triggers of the things that have happened to you online. So that's to be expected. Panic attacks when reminded of the threatening event. So again, you'll have things that trigger those, and those don't necessarily go away just because the event is over, as we know with other types of trauma. The emotional and physical distress associated with reminders of the attack, exactly what I was just saying, such as opening emails or looking at the computer. It may become something that is an everyday thing that should be normal, is now not normal because of the trauma that you have experienced. So this is something that can be ongoing and needs addressing after the event has happened. And that's one of the things that we recommend you seek assistance for. So there is an aftermath. It doesn't go away instantly. It can go on for years, just like any other violent or event that has caused you to become a victim in this situation. So Denisha, if you want to go from here.
Oh, yeah. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on sexual violence and trauma, and I'm going to try to keep it short. But just because these forms of sexual abuse take place behind a screen doesn't make their impact on the victim any less real, right? So people can and do experience traumatic stress from this. So you can see here the definition. Trauma is defined as an intense experience that causes an overwhelming emotional and psychological stress. And again, I want to point out that we're not defining, what is traumatic for someone else. If they're experiencing that deep stress, then it's not our place to question that or to question the validity of what happened to them. So, every person reacts to traumatic experiences differently. As you saw in the previous slide, as Sarah was saying, some of us may have even experienced traumatic stress firsthand. And it might even take some time to even realize the effects that it has had on us, because, trauma changes your brain. So here we go. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the neurobiology of trauma and what goes on in the brain, but I wanted to put it in because I do think it's important to just touch on it a little bit, because to really combat victim blaming narratives, we need to understand what's happening in the brain, because a lack of understanding of this can cause, generally well-meaning people to say things that can come across as sort of accusatory or victim blaming. So basically, your prefrontal cortex in the brain is kind of like the executive function. So it helps us to kind of regulate our emotions, to make choices that are consistent with our goals and values. It helps us to manage other brain regions. And it becomes impaired or sometimes even shut down when we experience a traumatic situation or traumatic stress. And we don't control that. It is an automatic brain response to trauma. And then the fear center, or the amygdala, ends up taking over. So one way to kind of look at this is to think about the amygdala as kind of like a smoke detector and the prefrontal cortex as a watchtower. So, is the smoke that you smell a sign that your house is on fire and you need to get out fast? Or is it coming from, the steam from the shower or the steak that you put over too high a flame? So the amygdala is not making that kind of judgment. It's just getting you ready to react even before that prefrontal cortex weighs in. And this all happens very fast, right? So if your prefrontal cortex is, unimpaired, you're able to kind of, think through and abort that stress response. But if it is impaired, then that fear center takes over and it does what it thinks it needs to do in order to survive both physically and mentally. So in the case of that smoke detector, when our prefrontal cortex is underactivated, it might take you sort of a long time to kind of come down from that. You might freeze up. If the sound is associated with a traumatic memory, then it might trigger you because traumatic memories are often stored as sensory. And that's also why, a yellow sweater or a particular word in a comment or opening an email may end up triggering somebody because it's sensory memories that we store. And this is the result of a hyperactive fear center. So, this can have very lasting effects on the brain. The prefrontal cortex can remain underactivated while the fear center is overactivated. So even long after the event, as Sarah said, like these aftermaths can last, years even. The brain may keep sending signals to the body to kind of escape a threat that may no longer exist or a perceived threat. And so, many people end up reporting things like chronic stress, vigilance, difficulty concentrating, again, because that prefrontal cortex is underactivated. So we just need to be mindful that trauma really does have effects on the brain. Like it's not something that's, quote unquote, just in your head or something that you can snap out of or, just think positive, right? Like it actually changes your brain. But, just as trauma can rewire your brain, it is also capable of healing. So, there's a really great book if you're interested in learning more about how trauma affects the brain called The Body Keeps the Score. I actually took that smoke detector example from that book, but it kind of goes into detail more about what's happening in the brain, and it's pretty accessible too. So yeah, automatic response that we really don't control. So I will pass it to Sarah.
Okay, so we just have a few minutes left. Someone had requested where they can get the videos. The videos are available online, and we'll make those available to you also. What the center is all about is supporting someone who has been a victim of sexual assault, whether that is online or in person. The main absolute thing that I can say is believe them and validate them. So when someone has presented with something that has traumatized them, certainly in a sexual assault, whether in person or online, we want to let that person know that we believe them, that we stand by them, that it is not their fault. And that victim blaming or accusatory language we need to avoid completely. It is never their fault. They did not ask for it. They did not do anything to entice it. It is not their fault. And that's the bottom line. We also need to think about, what happens to one person could happen to another person and they react differently. Remembering that healing is not linear. It's not the same for everyone, just like the experience may be similar, but it's not exactly the same. So we have to remember each person is an individual, and we want to support them in their individuality as well, and be patient with them, because as Denisha just said, it could happen, it could go on for years, or some people deal with trauma in different ways. So they're going to have different reactions and different healing time. It's very important for us to normalize their reactions, that just because somebody reacts a certain way, do not invalidate that. Absolutely let them know that what they're feeling is perfectly normal for them. Because we cannot judge, just like Denisha was saying, you can't say what's traumatic for someone is not traumatic for someone else. And in that same way, the way that someone reacts to that trauma could be different. So normalize their reactions, let them know that, yes, this is to be expected and that it's going to take time to heal. And that goes along with validating their feelings. And those can be like a roller coaster. It's not going to be the same thing every day. So just validate them, let them know that, that they are absolutely valid in whatever that they are feeling. And I think at this point, we're going to open it up for some questions, if there are anything else.
Yeah, and I just want to add real quick, when it comes to like that, validating their feelings when you're supporting someone, it can be really frustrating for someone sometimes when, we're in the middle of our healing journey and we're doing the things that we're kind of supposed to do, right? Like going to therapy or sort of practicing self-care. And maybe those things don't seem to be working, especially when we see other people and it's like working for them. But, it's important to remind them that, like she said, everybody's healing journey is not the same. So some people may say like, oh, well, why is this not working? Or they may feel even more down on themselves. And it's okay to say, I understand this is frustrating. And if you're supporting someone, it's important to remind them to just be patient with themselves and for you to be patient with them as well, as Sarah said, because healing is different for everyone. But any small step is still a step, right? Even if it feels super minute, and those steps add up. So yeah, that's the last thing I'll say. And then we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. And I can't see the chat, so.
And just to reiterate, Denisha, those videos that we included can be available to anyone online?
Yes, so I can, let's see for the link. Yeah, so those are available online. I can actually drop the link for it in the chat. Sarah, if you want to kind of go over a little bit about what coercion is again, while I get that video.
Yes, absolutely. So coercion is, to answer the question that was asked, coercion is using some kind of pressure to have someone provide either pictures or information, videos, without necessarily their consent. So they may do it, but they feel pressured. They're being, it's not a comfortable situation. So they're actually feeling pressured into something. So coercion is not a voluntary, it's not done under how can I say that? It's not done voluntarily. The person doing the coercion is trying to pressurize somebody to do something, and maybe even guilt them into it. They're going to use different tactics like, blackmail and threats, that type of thing. So that's when you're coercing someone. You're trying to get someone to do something that they don't really want to do. And in this context, we're talking about providing sexual pictures, explicit pictures, or videos, and that type of thing. So did you want to add to that, Denisha, or is that?
I think you covered that wonderfully.
Okay. Any last minute questions? That's a good question about ways to support online survivors of online harassment, and now they have to go to work or school online, and that's definitely, I know Denisha may have some more to say about that, but that's what I was saying, being reminded of that every time you get on your computer and open an email, every time you have to log into a Zoom meeting, or you have to share your screen with someone, could be a reminder and could certainly be a trigger for those traumatic behaviors, the reactions to come up again. So the best way, probably, I don't know, Denisha may want to jump in here, but to be able to disassociate a little bit between what happened before and what is happening now. So if they're having to do school online or go to a work meeting online, not having it trigger them, I think the coping mechanisms, as far as being in a safe space, knowing where you are, feeling comfortable in yourself, and surrounding yourself with either something that makes you feel safe, like music or whatever that you might take to take your mind off of that previous traumatic experience.
Yeah, I think you cover that again very wonderfully. If you can even see, is there somebody like a coworker or someone that they trust that they would be willing to speak to? Of course, they don't have to And it's also okay to ask. You can ask somebody, what's the best way for me to support you? What is the best way for me to help you? And that also helps them get back that sense of control, right? Because they've experienced a loss of control. So any way they can get that back is really powerful. You could even do, a safety plan to check in with them. I'm going to call this person at 5 p.m. every day. And so if they don't call, then what does that mean, right? So even something like that, where you're constantly checking in with somebody that you trust, even doing some grounding techniques. Like if somebody is kind of going through, they're online and they're maybe experiencing like a flashback or getting triggered, maybe even doing some grounding techniques with them of saying, okay, what are 5 things that you can see around you right now? What are 4 things that you can, feel, things that you can smell, things to kind of remind them that they are here and present in this moment. So you can try some different grounding techniques as well. The 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a pretty popular method in terms of helping people who may be experiencing like flashbacks or triggers.
Absolutely. I'm not sure if we have much time left. Someone asked about, how can they respond if someone asks to have pictures, send pictures? And I would say go with your own conscience on that. Just being able to say, I'm not comfortable with that. I don't feel that's appropriate right now. You can respond however you want. People shouldn't ever have to feel pressured. Again, that's leading into coercion, that you feel pressured to do it. That means maybe you don't want to do it. So if you don't want to share something, don't share it. Just simply say, I don't feel comfortable doing that, and leave it at that. You don't have to in any way feel obligated, especially like we're saying online, it doesn't just go to that person necessarily. So if you're doing it, through texting or whatever, you think it's private, but it could end up being, public. So absolutely, you have control. Take control of that and say, I don't feel comfortable. I'm not going to do that.
And there are different laws against revenge porn. It's going to be different for each state, but I know that there are definitely laws in place for helping people who have been victims of revenge porn.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was awesome. I learned a lot, and I think especially in the pandemic, everything is online. It's definitely representative of where we are right now, where all of us are across the world. So this was really great, and thank you so much. It was awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. And yeah, I'm gonna just drop our contact, like our emails in the chat. If you want to reach out with any questions, we're happy to answer any of those.